Hello, my name is Kristen Iddig. I'm a partner in the Government Contracts Group at Arnold and Porter. With me today is my colleague Chris Eukins. He's counsel here at the firm and also a professor of government contracts law at George Washington University.
Thanks for inviting me today, Kristen.
I'm glad to be here with you. Chris and I are here to talk to you this morning about the White House's recently issued policy on what is an inherently governmental function. On September 12th of 2011, the Office of Management and Budget issued a long-awaited policy letter on what is an inherently governmental function. One of the things that I think is interesting to start with on this letter is that when the letter was issued in draft form in March of 2010, it was entitled Work Reserved for Performance by Federal Government Employees, with the clear implication being, I think, and tell me if you think this is right, Chris, that this was all about what work should be reserved for government employees and making sure that appropriate functions were withheld only for performance by government employees. This had contractors kind of scared because there was a big concern that there would be a large push towards insourcing functions that had been long performed by contractors. Just this week, the White House issued the final version of the letter, and now the title is Performance and Management of Inherently Governmental and Critical Functions. And so that title says to me that we've got a bit of a new focus here, that we're trying to strike a balance between what should be performed by government employees and what should be performed by contractor employees. And the basic test that we're looking at is that if something is inherently governmental, it has to be performed by a federal government employee. And if it's not inherently governmental, then we've got to balance the interest between the public interest in having these functions performed by government employees versus the fiscal interests in making sure that we do this in a cost-effective way. And so I think that the message that we're receiving from the White House and the Office of Management and Budget is that insourcing should be used as a tool. It's not an end in and of itself. And I think that that provides some reassurance to the contracting community that this is a tool for making sure that there is not over-reliance on contractors while still recognizing the value of using contractors to support government functions.
I think it's worthwhile focusing actually on the language on the slide and on slide 2. The guidance is nothing in this guidance is intended to discourage the appropriate use of contractors. Very clear signal that there's been a shift since the early days of the Obama administration.
Exactly. So we wanted to talk to you a bit about the history of how we got here, and this has been a long time coming. We've called this the long-awaited White House policy, and it is a long-awaited policy. Back in October of 2008, when Congress passed the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2009, they asked OMB to develop a single, consistent standard for all of government to use on what is inherently governmental. There were a number of different standards that were out there, and there was a concern that there was not a consistency. A presidential memo came out in 2009 about drawing that line between inherently governmental and what can be contracted out. There were some more initiatives that are detailed on our slide about what should be insourced and what should be outsourced, and a good bit of discussion followed by, as we said, the draft policy letter in March of 2010, and then a final policy letter just this month in September. I think it would make sense now to move to our next slide, and Chris, if you could talk about the different categories that are laid out in the policy letter, I think that would be helpful.
Thanks, Kristen. There are 3 basic categories. The first is inherently governmental. And if something is inherently governmental, a function is inherently governmental if it's so intimately related to the public interest that it requires performance by a government employee. Functions that are inherently governmental can never be performed by contractors under this final policy letter from OFPP.
Right, and one of the things that I think is so interesting is there's been this big effort to make sure that we had one single definition of what is inherently governmental, and then we've got the definition that is laid out here. It's the same definition that was in the FAIR Act, and it's the same definition that is in the FAR. So it's not really much of a shift in definitions, is it?
No, it's exactly the same. That's the ironic thing. We've come full circle back to exactly the same definition that's in OMB circular and in the FAR, the same definition of inherently governmental. We haven't fundamentally changed that. The final policy letter also adds these 2 other categories, closely associated with inherently governmental and critical functions. Closely associated with inherently governmental are functions that are closely associated with functions that are in fact inherently governmental. With regards to those functions, OFPP was very clear. that agencies are not required to have government employees do them. Contractors can perform these functions, but agencies should give first consideration, if possible, to using government employees. And if contractors are performing these closely associated functions, then the agency has to specially monitor those functions.
Right. Now, Chris, there was some push during the consideration of the draft policy letter to have those closely associated functions be reserved also for government employees. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, and I think the fact that at the end of the day, OFPP made it very clear that these functions, these closely associated functions, can be performed by contractors is again a clear statement of balance on the part of OFPP. The last category is critical functions, and this category really came out of a concern going into the Obama administration that entire domains within the government had been outsourced. For example, entire IT departments. The idea behind the critical function category is that agencies have to ensure that they have the internal capacity to maintain control over functions that are critical to the agency mission. And so for critical functions, the agencies, for instance, in an IT department, the agencies have to maintain sufficient senior personnel to make sure that the mission of the agency is being accomplished. That's what the purpose of the critical function is, to really focus agencies on maintaining sufficient capacity internally to accomplish their critical mission.
I think one of the interesting things about the structure of the policy letter is that when we look at inherently governmental functions, there's an appendix to the policy letter that lists a number of examples of what is inherently governmental that builds on the list that was already published in the Federal Acquisition Regulation and adds to it. And then there is also a list of what functions are considered to be closely associated with inherently governmental. There was some push to have a similar example list for the critical functions, but that didn't make it into the final policy letter.
No, and if we could just skip down for a few slides to the examples that you're alluding to. That's exactly right, Chris. And the policy letter sets up examples for inherently governmental functions, for example, combat, for functions that are closely associated with inherently governmental, such as conducting market research. A contractor can provide support functions like that. But it doesn't give a list of examples for critical functions because it recognizes, the policy letter recognizes that what's critical is highly contextual, it's highly fact-specific. But that brings us full circle to the question of what's inherently governmental. There is a definition of what's inherently governmental, and it really defines what is inherently governmental, but it doesn't describe why we consider these functions inherently governmental. Why is it that some people think a park ranger always has to be a federal employee, while some people think it's appropriate to have that park ranger outsourced? This is a really critical, very difficult policy question. And in different cultures, we address this, for instance, in the United Kingdom, it's perfectly normal to outsource government lawyering work, where in the United States we would think that inappropriate. We really haven't thought through the question why we consider certain functions inherently governmental. And if I'd have to identify one disappointing area in the OFPP letter is that we really haven't completely probed that question. Why do we consider certain functions inherently governmental?
Right. I think that's a really important point to make. As many good things as there are to say about the letter, it is one of the shortcomings that the question of why is not addressed. And I think that the result of that is that we will see a continued debate on the question of why and continued confusion about the definition of inherently governmental. There's a lot of good guidance in the letter, but the fundamental why question still has not been answered and will lead to further confusion in the industry, I think, and in government.
Now, I just want to highlight one quirk quickly. If we could turn to slide number 9. The OFPP was facing a lot of political pressure as it issued this final letter because the Obama administration is very concerned about issuing a policy letter that might be read to hurt small businesses and hurt employment. It's imperative right now that employment be built. In responding to that criticism from small business, the idea that this policy letter might be read to encourage insourcing and therefore taking away jobs from small business, what OFPP did really is a political compromise. It said that if there is going to be any insourcing at a government facility, when the insourcing occurs and government employees are used to replace contractors, the rest of the remaining positions, if they're still contracted out, shall be subject to a new procurement, and in that procurement the rule of 2, which says if there are 2 small businesses available, the procurement will be set aside for those small businesses, the rule of 2 will be applied. So in essence what the Obama administration has said is that in the rules that are promulgated to implement this policy letter, it's very likely that if there's insourcing, that could trigger a re-procurement process that leaves small businesses in control of all the positions in a particular facility. It's a funny quirk, and it could have a very material impact down the road.
I think it'll also have an impact in another area, and in the reference to the rule of two. We saw in the GAO decision in Delex a number of years ago that the rule of two was to be upheld, but I think many in industry would argue that the rule of two has been observed more in the breach than anything else, and that it hasn't been regularly followed. I think by OFPP specifically calling out the rule of two as a priority in this policy letter, we might see an increased focus on that in other procurements, even those that aren't subject to insourcing or outsourcing.
Now, just to wrap up, Chris, and I did want to ask you, taking all this together, do you think that this is an important change in policy?
I think it is an important statement from the White House, but I don't know that it's an important change. I don't think it really changes where we are. It's the policy letter, from my perspective, is as important for what it doesn't do as for what it does. It does not say that certain functions must be insourced right away. It doesn't set timing for when that has to happen. It doesn't have a focus on, a continued focus on insourcing, which we were seeing for a number of years at the beginning of the Obama administration. I think it's important because it brings us a bit back towards the center and shows us that the focus right now is on the balance between the two interests.
I agree. I think this is a stepping stone towards further policy in the area, and also I completely agree. It marks a shift to the center in the Obama administration's approach to procurement policy. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you. Interesting to start with on this letter is that when the letter was issued in draft form in March of 2010, it was entitled "Work Reserved for Performance by Federal Government Employees," with the clear implication being, I think, and tell me if you think this is right, Chris, that this was all about what work should be reserved for government employees and making sure that appropriate functions were withheld only for performance by government employees. This had contractors kind of scared because there was a big concern that there would be a large push towards insourcing functions that had been long performed by contractors. Just this week, the White House issued the final version of the letter, and now the title is "Performance." Hello, my name is Kristen Iddig. I'm a partner in the Government Contracts Group at Arnold and Porter. With me today is my colleague Chris Eukins. He's counsel here at the firm and also a professor of government contracts law at George Washington University.
Thanks for inviting me today, Kristen.
I'm glad to be here with you. Performance and management of inherently governmental and critical functions. And so that title says to me that we've got a bit of a new focus here, that we're trying to strike a balance between what should be performed by government employees and what should be performed by contractor employees. And the basic test that we're looking at is that if something... Chris and I are here to talk to you this morning about the White House's recently issued policy on what is an inherently governmental function. On September 12th of 2011, the Office of Management and Budget issued a long-awaited policy letter on what is an inherently governmental function. One of the things that I think is